All right, we're going to get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for MBA's webinar on elder financial abuse. My name is Tess Rice. I'm General Counsel for the Minnesota Bankers Association. We're delighted to have Dr. Marty DeLima and Marty Fleischecker from the Department of Commerce with us today to discuss the prevention of elder financial abuse. Dr. DeLima is an interdisciplinary gerontologist and assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Minnesota. Professor DeLima studies financial victimization using focus groups, in-depth surveys, interviews, and panel data. She regularly collaborates with financial institutions, AARP, the FINRA Foundation, and federal protection agencies to analyze victimization risk factors and to test efforts to protect consumers from fraud and abuse. Marty Fleischecker is probably familiar to many of you. He's a senior financial fraud ombudsman at the Minnesota Department of Commerce and has guided many banks and their customers through fraud situations and has saved consumers, let's just say, millions of dollars. So Dr. DeLima will start us off sharing her insights on the latest trends and scams, as well as how financial decision-making is affected by age-related changes in the brain. She'll address the signs of suspicious activity and troubling behavior that financial institutions should look out for. We will leave time for questions, so please post any you have for Dr. DeLima and Marty Fleischecker, and we'll do our best to get to them. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. DeLima.
Thanks so much, Tess. So I am Marty DeLima. I'm, as Tess said, I'm an assistant professor here at the School of Social Work. Before I came to Minnesota, I was a postdoc and a senior researcher at the Stanford Center on Longevity at Stanford University. And we really looked at a lot of factors impacting older adults and their potential vulnerability to fraud. So in this talk, I'm going to cover, some of the age-related changes in the brain that might make a person more susceptible to scams or to manipulation by a friend or family member. So my co-presenter with me today is Marty Fleischecker. Marty is here really to be available to answer questions about his program at Commerce. But I will be leading today's presentation. So why am I here with Marty? Why are we partnering? So we received a federal grant last year from the Administration for Community Living to study the outcomes of Marty's program at Commerce, which is the law called Chapter 45A, or the Safe Seniors Financial Protection Act. And I imagine that many of you on this webinar are familiar with Chapter 45A, have reported a case to Marty's group. And this will help kind of be a refresher on what Marty does when he receives a case and how to report. So part of our grant is actually to do these outreach presentations and to let people know throughout the state about Marty's program and give them feedback and guidance on how to report elder financial exploitation and elder fraud. So the mission of Commerce is really to protect and assist consumers. They do a lot of outreach and engagement with our communities, but they also have regulatory oversight of so many different agencies. So it'll kind of make sense as we go along why Marty's program is administered through the Department of Commerce. So here are some of the services and industries that Commerce regulates. Financial institutions is on there, as you can see. Also telecommunications, licensing, and they have the Senior Financial Fraud Program that Marty leads. So I'm going to turn my focus away from what is Commerce and what does it do to really talk about kind of the research that we're doing in financial exploitation and fraud and what we've seen in our aging population that might make people more susceptible. So the first risk factor, or the first thing I want to try to lay the groundwork for is some definitions. So when I talk about elder financial exploitation, there's really these two main subtypes. One is fraud and scams, and the other is financial abuse. And the big differentiator that we use as researchers is who is the perpetrator. If the perpetrator stands in a position of trust to the older adult, so maybe they're an adult child, a family member, a neighbor, a paid caregiver, we call that financial abuse. So it's someone for whom the relationship already exists, kind of outside of the exploitative context. But if we think about fraud and scams, those are perpetrated by strangers. Of course, those strangers might build trust over time, but the strangers engaged in this relationship for the purpose of exploiting the older adult. And also we know that fraud and scams involve an act of deception. in order to convince a person to willingly give over information or money. So I want to first talk about broad societal trends that are really going to impact the prevalence of fraud, scams, and elder abuse in America. So the first is that we are an aging nation, like many other nations in the world. Older people in Minnesota currently outnumber both children and teenagers combined. This happened during the pandemic, I believe, this demographic shift. And it's probably going to persist. And this is the first time in US history that we are seeing older populations outnumbering teenagers and children. So it's actually the oldest residents, so people age 85 and older, that are expected to grow the fastest, thanks to our longer lifespan. So they're going to more than double in the next 35 years. So two other kind of society level trends I think are going to supercharge the prevalence of fraud. So the first is that we see a very large population, demographic generation group called the baby boomers that are aging. And most of them at this point, or they still are leaving the workforce, but they have accrued the majority of our nation's wealth. So I think the most recent stat is that the baby boomers have more than 70% of our nation's wealth. So over the next 2 decades, as the baby boomers pass on, we're going to see this massive wealth transfer to the next generation. So one economist says it's $68 trillion that is going to pass hands from baby boomers to their adult children. And I believe that that's going to create a lot of opportunities for greedy family members, for financial perpetrators, to try to take advantage of that money as it's flowing down generations. The second big societal shift that I think exposes older adult populations to a greater risk of fraud is the switch from pensions to 401ks and 403bs. So, and I'm not going to spend time today arguing the merits of either one, but we do know that if you have a 401k or 403b, you have a lot more control and decisions to make about your retirement assets than someone who's paid off of a pension, where it's just a monthly check that they get after they retire till the day that they die. So you can imagine that criminals and scam artists and seedy investment advisors might try to convince an older retiree to move their 401k into a fund that they control or a fund that doesn't exist in order to steal their money. With a pension, they have much less, the perpetrators have much less access to that giant kind of bowl of money. So those are two societal factors, but then there's also individual factors that might make people more susceptible to deception as they age. And I want to start out by saying that these indicators are not universal, that everyone, reaches old age in a very different state. And many people actually reach old age very, very highly sophisticated and cognitively intact. And maybe they were a lifelong techie. So they, some of these risk factors aren't really present for them. But these are some of the things that we notice in the research to be predictors of exploitation. So the first one is impaired cognitive functioning, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Loneliness and social isolation. So social isolation is the actual act of being alone, and loneliness is kind of the perception of being alone and feeling lonely. And then we have, less sophistication with technology, and we see that in the data where older adults are more likely to be the victims of tech support scams. And then also, as I said before, the baby boomers and those who are older have more assets than younger generations. So if you are a criminal, you probably would want to target the more wealthy, basically victim, than someone who doesn't have much to part with. So this is some data from my colleagues at Rush University, where they recruited a large, healthy sample of older adults and followed them over time. So they have over 1,000 people in this study. And what they did is they gave them a cognitive assessment every year. So the same individuals over time. And what they found was by year 7, about 22% of the participants had developed dementia. So about 1 in 4. But 78% were aging normally, or they didn't have evidence of cognitive decline. So they're along this top line here, this normal aging line. However, when they administered tests to these individuals around financial decision-making and healthcare decision-making, they found that 30 to 40% of those who are on that top line, the normal agers, were still making more suboptimal financial choices relative to their younger counterparts. So they did find some declines in what we call executive functioning, the part of the brain that helps you plan, helps you reason, helps you kind of evaluate competing choices. Like which healthcare plan should I choose from? Which investment opportunity is better for me? So these are really subtle declines. They usually occur before any other changes related to age, like issues with driving, with making meals, dressing. So these things happen without family members really identifying the deficits. And again, that can expose a person to risk of financial, just poor decision-making, but also fraud, scams, and exploitation. This is a different study that administered the financial literacy quiz to people across the life course. So this isn't following the same people over time. These are people of different ages. You can see from age 60, to up into the 80s. And you can see that on average, there's only 5 questions in the financial literacy quiz. But on average, people in their 80s are scoring much worse than those in their 60s. So this is a statistically significant difference between age 60 and age 85. But another thing that these researchers did was they asked the participant, to rate how confident they were that the answer that they provided was correct. And so what you see in this chart is that people are not performing very well, but they think they're performing well. And so there's this widening gap over the life course between actual financial performance and perceived financial performance. And I would say that this gap right here is the gold mine for scammers, because the individual lacks insight that they are struggling with money management and financial decisions. So talked about cognitive decline and changes in financial decision-making. Another major risk factor for fraud and for elder financial exploitation and abuse by friends and family is being alone, is social isolation. So about a quarter of older Americans live alone, and these trends are increasing because many of us are unmarried. So we are living kind of a life unpartnered. And the other concern, though, is that we also don't tend to get out as much as we should. So the majority of US adults don't participate in any kind of official social group, like a religious organization, a club, or a sports team, or things like that. And if you ask people how they're feeling, we have seen there's kind of an increasing loneliness trend in the United States and elsewhere. So this data, I think, was collected by AARP, found a third of adults age 45 and older report feeling lonely. I do want to kind of maybe disrupt a myth. Younger adults actually report higher levels of loneliness than older adults. But again, for all age groups, social isolation is a risk factor. And then finally, I don't want to minimize the impact of just major life changes that kind of create these periods of instability that make a person maybe more open to learning about new opportunities or trying to figure out the next thing, or open to receiving help from a stranger, like the loss of a spouse, having to take on the financial decision-making responsibilities of a household. Maybe the spouse who used to do those tasks passes away, retirement, leaving work, major hospitalizations. So all of these just create these contexts where manipulation is easier. So I think I'm going to pause there and just see if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask.
We did have a question about whether it's possible to file an anonymous report for financial exploitation.
Yeah, Marty can answer that.
Okay.
Sure. I started typing an answer, but I'm happy. So whoever wrote that, I'm sorry if there was any negativity, but you can just put it in there. You want to remain anonymous. That's fine when people file a report. But the problem is that I have to discuss banking information typically with people, so they assume where it came from, whether I tell them or not. And so I've had other banks say, well, you told them. Well, no, I did not tell them, but it was pretty obvious when I start discussing the hold on the bank account that we're going to place, or the fact that they may lose their bank account if they continue with the risky information or activity, that they assume who made the report. I know that Adult Protective Services runs into the same. I literally just had within the last couple of days that same discussion where an Adult Protective Services investigator said, I did not say anything, I cannot say anything, but the person, they presumed or assumed who it was. But I'm not saying I didn't in the situation that somebody's raising here. It could have happened, but again, call me. I'm not hard to get a hold of. My phone number, I think, is at the end here, and we'll definitely discuss it or just put it in the report. Reporter wants to remain anonymous.
There's another question just posted asking what resources are available to financial institutions beyond filing the MARC report and SARS. If nothing results from these reports, but the bank still believes that the financial exploitation is happening, what else can they do?
All right, well, Marty's program is one answer to that, and we're going to cover that in a little bit. I'm wondering if there's any other comments you want to make about that, Marty. Marty.
I know you're going to remind people, but I just want to remind people that, if the person's vulnerable, then the MARC gets the first opportunity to deal with that person. Okay, so if they're defined in Minnesota law as a vulnerable person, or even if it's the activity of that person, or something raises concerns, maybe power of attorney is already working on the person's behalf or something, the MARC I'm going to report it to the MARC, even if it's reported to me, so that they can work with me on those cases. But the people who do not have any cognitive decline, who don't have any sort of vulnerability that you can detect, and they're 65 or older, those people automatically my program can deal with, and oftentimes the MARC can't because the people don't meet the vulnerability standards.
Okay, so we'll save the remaining questions for a little bit later if there are any. So who is vulnerable to scams? All of us are vulnerable to scams. Criminals use social engineering tactics to make a really solid pitch, and they get us at a time when we might be distracted or haven't slept well. In so many of my interviews with victims over the years, the stories that they tell me are just uncanny. A couple women that I spoke to had just fallen outside on the winter ice when they walked in, and then they get a call. So they were already shaking and hurting. And it's just like, how did the criminals know that that was the time to try to target these women with some sort of, fear-based pitch, like a grandparent scam, or a tech support scam. But, so not only do they kind of capitalize on the things that we're already going through in our lives, but they also use tactics like building emotion in the pitch, whether that's threatening us, making us feel deeply afraid. I did a study on the Social Security imposter scam, and that was really based on fear and intimidation. But then so many other scams offer something positive, something you want, like maybe it's a romantic partner, or it's a large sum of money, or a lottery that you've just won. So they also bring in excitement. And so much of the literature and psychology looking at, attention resources and cognitive load really point to the impact of emotion on decision making. And it tends to make us make quick, more heuristic decisions and be more easily influenced. They also isolate the targets. Many criminals, especially like in romance scam situations, will tell the older adult or the young adult, don't tell your family members about us, they'll never understand. Or don't tell your family that you're about to be a millionaire, because everyone will just be coming after you and your money. Also using anonymous communication, WhatsApp, not using a real, personal phone number, but hiding and blinding their real identity. And then they build trust. I study the gift card in scams, and I can't tell you how many times my participants said, the cashier was telling me that this was a scam, but I was being coached, through my earbud on the phone with the scammer to just ignore what they were saying to me. And I think that speaks to what a lot of financial institutions face too, where, they are kind of in this invisible battle with this third party criminal on the other line who's trying to convince the customer to not listen and to be antagonistic back against the teller or banker, or, in my case, in my study, the retailers. And then, of course, they abuse that authority by trying to convince the person to send, wire, purchase gift cards, whatever it is, to do the money transfer. So I just want to talk really briefly about some new trends that we're seeing in scams that are really being driven by the cryptocurrencies, but also generative AI. So this is a face that I generated in a couple seconds using a website called thispersondoesnotexist.com. It's pretty fun. You can use it too. You just pick your gender, your age, your ethnicity, and boom, you get a new photo. So I think a lot of the early consumer education said things like, if it's someone approaching you on Facebook or whatever, do a reverse image search. Make sure that image wasn't stolen, from a real person on the web. So criminals don't have to steal images anymore. They can create their own suite of images of a person, like this person who doesn't exist on the slide, in seconds. So a lot of our consumer education, like don't pick up the phone if you don't recognize who's calling, all of that we have to throw out, because criminals can also spoof phone numbers and caller IDs. So they can make it look like mom is calling and it'll be mom's phone number. So we all have to kind of rethink the advice that we've been telling our clients, our friends, our family members about how to stay safe from scams. And just to kind of put this in perspective, there was some news stories lately, and this is just one of 4 that I found about criminals using voice deepfakes. So taking a couple, minutes or seconds even of audio from an adult child. Kids have TikTok and Snapchat and Facebook, so many videos of themselves out in the world. You can take that audio and create basically an AI voice model of them. And this woman thought her daughter was on a ski trip, got a call from her daughter, but it turns out it was just the criminals using the daughter's voice to try to convince the woman that she was kidnapped and needed funds wired. And in this other story, this guy said, let me train a little AI on my voice and see if I can break through my bank's kind of voice, ID. And it happened in seconds, and the AI got into all of his bank accounts. So again, the world of cybersecurity is really having to shift with the rise of generative AI. So how much does elder abuse or elder financial exploitation and fraud cost? Well, if we look at the actual methods of transfer to criminals, this is all scams. You can see that although, gift cards might be one of the most common methods that older adults use to transfer money to criminals, but it's not the most costly. The most costly are crypto and bank transfer, because you can move a lot more money in just a couple clicks than you can in a gift card. You might be able to buy, 500 gift cards at a time, but you can't, it's not $20,000. So, and it used to be wire transfer. Wire transfer used to be the big money loser, but now it's moving into things like Zelle and crypto. And we might see some legislation coming down the pipeline regarding, banks' liability for some of these transfers. So for older Americans, we actually find that they report significantly higher median losses than young adults. So, and it really jumps up in the 80s. We don't know if that's because they're being victimized more times by the same perpetrator. If it's a romance scam and it finally gets reported, you might report the sum amount that was lost. And actually for romance scams, the median loss for older adults is around $10,000. So this is for all scams combined. According to the FTC, this is the prevalence of financial fraud for adults 65 to 74. It's about 1 in 10, so still pretty high, and then a little bit lower for those 75 plus. But this is all self-report in a survey, So again, people who are cognitively impaired, didn't recognize that they were victims, or too ashamed to admit it on the survey, would probably say no. So this number might even be an underestimate of the true prevalence. And then according to AARP, this is a brand new study that just came out this year. They kind of did some back of the envelope calculations and found that total annual losses among adults 60 and older is around $28 billion. So that's for fraud and financial exploitation combined. For fraud alone, it was just $8 billion. So adults tend to lose more money when the perpetrator is a friend or a family member who maybe has been their caregiver for a long time and has had access to their funds for a long time. It's kind of a slow, longer drain, but scams, of course, are still pretty costly. So I don't want to just emphasize the financial impact. In my interviews with victims, they report they cry, they report deep feelings of just shame. In some of the complaints that I've read to the Federal Trade Commission, they've reported that they've tried to take their own lives. A lot of broken marriages when the spouse finds out that the person has, given away all the money in an investment scam, so to speak. So much emotional trauma as a result of victimization. So I'm going to do just one more pause, and then we'll get into the final part of the presentation on Marty's program, the Safe Seniors Financial Protection Act. Any new questions?
Not right now. We don't.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk, and Marty will chime in, and if there's any questions, he'll be the one to probably answer them. So I want to talk about reporting to APS, doing a MARC report, and also to Commerce, and kind of what can each of those organizations do to help protect your customer or client. So first, when do you report? What are the indicators that a report might be necessary? So kind of two categories. There's suspicious financial activities, so what you see in the account, and also suspicious behavior, what you see from the customer or client. So suspicious activity, and I probably don't even have to go into this as much in depth. This is very probably familiar and part of the training for financial professionals, but it's things like uncharacteristic activity, changes in address. So maybe statements are now getting mailed to somewhere new. And some of this actually has really good reasons for, maybe the older adult, needs to move into a facility, or finally the adult children are starting to try to take over and provide support, and they want to see the bank statements to make sure nothing is off. But then in other cases, it is suspicious activity. Changes in power of attorney designation, especially when you already suspect that the older person lacks the capacity to make those changes and to be, have capacity to sign a new power of attorney. Suspicious signatures, and then of course, if a third party, especially an unauthorized third party, is doing all of their financial business. So suspicious behavior, that's if the older adult might come in and they might be confused about transactions. Maybe they call multiple times a day. Maybe if you ask them questions about the purpose of a transaction, they give you an evasive answer or just can't seem to remember, or someone else might speak on their behalf. This could obviously happen over the phone as well. You can hear kind of coaching in the background. And then also if the older adult might appear really anxious or unusually excited. And then there might be other signs like of self-neglect. So if they appear disheveled, that they're kind of lacking hygiene and not taking care of themselves, all of those can foreshadow other types of financial risk. So let's start with Commerce. So what is the Safe Seniors Financial Protection Act, or Chapter 45A? Essentially, it prevents substantial financial losses from a client or customer by compelling financial services providers to place a temporary hold on certain account transactions, or just delay disbursements of clients who are suspected to be victims of financial exploitation or fraud. So it actually provides immunity to financial services providers for reporting and for holding the funds. And the great thing about this act is it's not a hard hold. So the client is still able to withdraw funds to pay their regular bills, like their daily living expenses. Maybe they're in an assisted living facility or they need to pay rent, all of those necessary bills are still paid out. It's just to stop the suspicious behavior or activity that is indicative of fraud or financial abuse. Another advantage of the Commerce Program, Chapter 45A, is that it protects any adult who is age 65 and older. So if the person is 65, there doesn't need to be evidence of vulnerability. However, if the person is under age 65, and then there is, that vulnerability standard is there. So here is more on the temporary hold. So how do we define a temporary hold? Well, it lasts 15 business days, so 3 weeks. That could be enough time for the scammer to get frustrated and move on, or for the investigation to really take place, for friends, family members to come on board and provide additional support to the client. They can be extended though by another 2 weeks, so 10 business days. And those are by request. Marty can request the bank or financial institution to extend the hold. Law enforcement can request, APS can request as well, and prosecutors can request. So a lot of different kind of entities, Marty is really putting the hold on. Law enforcement can also put the hold on or ask for you to put the hold on, but many more agencies can ask you to extend it. So another thing is the account holder. So the client is informed right away about the hold, and they have the right to appeal. And the Commissioner of Commerce has to make a decision about whether to release the hold or keep it on within 5 days of the appeal. But since the program has been in play, no clients have gone through the appeal process so far. So some have called Marty and said, I don't want this. How do I get rid of it? And he's explained it to them, but they've all just decided to wait it out. So again, like I say, I just want to emphasize that who is eligible for APS is very different from who is eligible for a hold. So hold is, a little bit more liberal policy. It's anyone 65 and older, or if they're younger than 65, then they have to be vulnerable. For a MARC report, that vulnerability criteria has to be there regardless of age. So also the reporting is quite simple. I'm going to show you some screenshots of the reporting page. Anyone can make a report. Marty receives reports from family members, from healthcare providers, mostly from financial institutions, from law enforcement. So it's kind of an open for all reporting form. So here's where you find it. You would go to minnesota.mn.gov/commerce/money, and you'd click on the Senior Fraud Toolkit. You can also probably Google and find the form that way. And then you'd go to file a complaint. So report senior financial fraud here. So that first page takes you here. And then here's a kind of a direct link to the form. If you have a phone and you want to take a picture of this slide, I'll leave it up. We can also put this in the chat. So maybe Marty, if you want to put the reporting form in the chat, that would be helpful, since I can't do it while I navigate the slides, but this is where you find it. And this is what it looks like. So the senior financial exploitation reporting form, the first section is you provide information about the person at risk of exploitation or that you suspect is being taken advantage of. Then you put in a little bit more about how to contact that individual, what you know about the person allegedly responsible for exploitation. So many times this is a third-party scammer, international, who knows what their real identity is. So you might say unknown, unavailable, or if the client gave you a name, even if it's a made-up name, you can put that here. Summary of facts, here's where you would briefly just describe what you have observed, what your concerns are, and then you want to just include some information about yourself. Here or even below might be a good place to say, I would like to be this information to be kept confidential from the client, but Marty needs your information in order to follow up with you to get more information about the case. So how do you know where you report and to whom you report? So let's say you notice a suspicious activity or you observe it, and then you ask yourself, is the client victim vulnerable? So do they have a dementing illness like cognitive impairment? Are they in a facility? If they're in a facility like an assisted living or if they receive care, like even home care from a licensed provider, that automatically puts them in the box of vulnerable. But that's saying no, they are, very healthy, still working 67-year-olds. Okay, so they're not vulnerable, but are they 65 and older? And if they are, that's when you can file a report with the Minnesota Department of Commerce. But if they're not 65, maybe they're 55, you would follow your standard procedures for addressing suspicious activity or fraud. So if they are vulnerable, you would file a MARC report to Adult Protective Services, and you can also file a report with the Minnesota Department of Commerce, especially if you feel that a hold would benefit this client and keep them safe. And I really want to make that point really clear. What Marty can do, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what he can do here. He receives the reports, he talks to the client, he as a third party, not as their financial institution, as someone who's concerned that the behavior that is being, exhibited or shown is worrisome and might lead to, financial loss. And so he tries to coach them on staying safe, on trying to get more information with them using motivational interviewing. But then he'll also work with you, the financial institution, to tell you whether or not a hold is necessary. And if there's kind of more going on, he might cross-report to local or federal law enforcement. For example, if the person might be acting as a money mule. But APS does not put the holds on. So APS can ask Marty to put the hold on, but they are not the group that would help you with that. They'll do a lot of work with the client as well. So they'll do a needs assessment. Does this person have adequate food and supervision and care? Can we get the family members to be involved? So often both parties being involved, APS and Commerce is really important for this person to stay safe, but they kind of do different things. So I just wanted to clarify that. And then let's see what else. So Marty works a lot with elder abuse, multidisciplinary teams with law enforcement, APS, the reporter, you'll be hearing from Marty and his group. And then also a lot of outreach with AARP, community groups, professional membership societies, and others. So again, a lot of collaboration between Commerce and the folks on the front line who are actually observing abuse and fraud. So I think this is one of my final slides, and I just want to say the kind of information that would be helpful to include in a report to help Marty know, what other institutions he might need to contact or to really understand what the behavior is. So I put this information here just to kind of give you some indicators of like, this is what a strong report would include. So the last thing I just want to mention about our grant and what we're trying to do is we're working to increase the racial diversity of clients who are referred for Chapter 45A protections. So prior to the grant, we actually weren't collecting data on client race and ethnicity, but now we are, because we're trying to make sure that people of all racial backgrounds have access to this protection. Because prior to that, there were some indicators that it was majority white clients. So one of our starting points here is to figure out why this is, why are the majority of clients white? And here are a couple reasons, and you're welcome to put in some reasons in the chat that you think we might be seeing that trend. But here's what we thought. So some communities of color might not be banked. Could be distrust of government and financial institutions. And maybe people of color and different race and ethnic groups bank in ways or exchange money with families or live in intergenerational households that make fraud less visible. So it's not that it's not happening, and financial abuse and exploitation isn't happening, but it's not visible to financial institutions that would be doing the reporting. So those are some of our kind of assumptions or hypotheses, and we're really working to try to change that to make sure that everyone has equal protection. So with that, I'm going to take questions. but I'm also hoping that you can respond to our short survey. This is a survey based on today's presentation. It's for our grant funding to show that we have been doing the outreach, which is one of our aims. And also we want to know what kind of agencies or groups or financial institutions we've been touching with this presentation. So who's receiving the information. It does ask for your name, but if you don't feel comfortable, you can leave that part blank, but we will not be following up with anyone after this survey. So we're not using any of the data to contact participants or individuals who attended this webinar. So with that, I'm going to leave this up. In fact, I'll pull up the survey from the QR code and put it in the chat. But do we have any questions? Maybe Marty can also answer some.
So Tess, if I could say one thing before I get a question here, and I see there are a couple things and they're great questions, comments, but when the way I see this program at Commerce, and you know this, Tess, because we worked on this for years before we got the law passed. And you know, when I was assistant commissioner and for enforcement for my whole career at Commerce, I was always on the other side of the table. But with these types of, you know, referrals, I see myself as a partner. So, you know, I take that personally. That comment that came in that, you know, somebody had a customer that wasn't happy with them, because I try it in every way possible. I try to avoid that scenario. Unfortunately, when power of attorneys and children's get shut off from, you know, when the tap gets turned off and they can't steal money anymore from mom and dad or whoever they're stealing it from, they get angry, and they get really angry. I talked to a woman till 9:30 last night who's a sister of somebody who's been stealing from the parents, and that woman is angry, and she is doing all kinds of crazy things to her sister and her mom and everybody else who shut the tap off. So sometimes we, you know, it's hard to avoid that. But what I do is I tell people, when I call them up, I tell them, look, you know, your financial institution had one tool in their toolbox. Basically, prior to this law, they could cancel the account, basically fire the account holder or the client and say, you know, go down the road. So they kick the can down the road, and the next financial institution has the same problem. This is us working together to try to maintain that bank account for, you know, the customer. And that's what I tell them. I said, your bank's doing you a favor here, because you know, they're trying to help find a way that your suspicious activity doesn't lead you to lose your bank account, because the bank cannot engage in fraud and they cannot engage in money laundering. There are big federal penalties if they do that. So it's not a choice. They have to do something about what you're doing. And not only that, but the bank has a risk on the back end because of the errors. They're going to come and say the bank didn't do enough. And that's why they have to refer to a program like mine, and they have to take other measures, because otherwise, you know, fighting fraud is not a profit center. I remind everybody, it's, you know, costs the resources, precious resources, that you could be helping your clients rather than fighting fraud. And this is not I have no problems whatsoever, unfortunately, with job security. I can tell you that right now. We have 2 positions posted right now. Finally, I got some funding, and I know I told you this, Tess. They got posted yesterday for 2 investigator positions because of my workload. With Dr. DeLima out there pounding the pavement for me, and also just, you know, financial institutions that are looking for help with these customers, and they don't have time to spend, you know, a half an hour, 2 hours answering questions continuously of these clients. And I try to do what we can. So, you know, I do everything in my power to take responsibility, and I always tell the financial institutions, blame me. When somebody comes in angry, blame me. Give them my cell phone number. I'll talk to them. And so, you know, if you have an experience with me that is different, I'd be surprised, because I always say that let the person vent on me. I don't care. I got tough skin. Wouldn't be the first time. All right. And somebody mentioned traffic with Mariana Van Zeller, especially if you're going to Google traffic, look at episode 1, season 1, episode 1, traffic, and it's has to do with investment scams, and it has to do with lottery scams out of Jamaica, and I think it was investment scams out of Israel. And that I refer people to that program all the time, especially my lottery scam victims, to the season 1, episode 1 of Traffic with Marianne Van Zeller. We have another question about Minnesota bank bordering Wisconsin. And I've had these questions many times from people who are bankers in, North Dakota and Wisconsin and especially. And this law, Chapter 45A, applies to people in Minnesota. So if they're a Minnesota resident, then we would have jurisdiction over the person. If they're just visiting a Minnesota Minnesota banking location, one of the branch locations, then, but they live in Wisconsin, they're a resident, they're domiciled in Wisconsin, then I don't think that I can put a hold on their account. Another state did ask me one time to help them out, and it was a joint Minnesota resident, and it was somebody who was a resident of both states. And I think they spent a little bit more time in our state, and it was another state that said, we don't have that law. Can you help us out? And I did work with them with their client. It was actually somebody in the government in another state who found out about our law, and they're working to get it passed in their state now.
There is a question about immunity provided in the Senior Safe Act. And so there's the state statute, which I helped write. So because of this, there's lots of protections in there for bankers. So what it says is,
and government employees.
A financial services provider or an employee of a financial services provider who in good faith complies with the statute is immune from administrative, civil, or criminal liability that might otherwise arise from the disclosure. So we try to do our best to make sure that you would not have any liability. But they're asking about what kind of training is necessary. So nothing under the state act, but I know there is a federal senior safe type statute, and I think there is some sort of training that has to go on with that. So are you familiar with that one, Marty?
Yeah, for securities especially, there's some training. I have a copy of the training program. Our securities folks used to go out and do the training, but after this new law came into effect, our old director moved on, and he used to report to me, and I don't know that the enforcement division is still engaged in I'm not part of the enforcement division, and so I don't know if they're still doing any of that sort of training. It's a couple hour training. Sorry, go ahead.
There's the federal statute on this talks about training being required in order to have immunity. It includes things like common signs of possible financial exploitation, how to identify and report, when appropriate, how to report to government officials or law enforcement, discuss the need to protect the privacy and respect the integrity of each individual customer. So it's pretty much what we're doing today is the type of training that a banker would need to have immunity under the federal act.
And one thing that I point people to is all those things that were on Dr. DeLima's list. I don't know, she might have added some of her own, but those were actual reasons why financial institutions said, here's why we're reporting it. But when I went back and I looked at FinCEN last year, if you Google FinCEN advisory June 15, so June 15 every year is World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. So if you Google FinCEN June 15, 2022 advisory, it's very comprehensive about activities and behavior and examples that FinCEN gave based on reporting, suspicious activity reporting, something that they put together as an advisory for financial institutions about when to report and what things to look out for. And it's, just a great document.
I know also the ABA has a lot of training resources for spotting senior fraud and what to do on their website. We have some on our website as well. We have a compliment here. Someone had very helpful and effective assistance via the MARC report, and they're happy to learn about the work that you do with the Department of Commerce. We have a question about what if the elder person doesn't want to press charges against a child? Would the state do that?
You know, I have that happen a lot of times, and I'm trying to build rapport with these people and trust to, get them to act in a certain way, or stop acting in whatever way that they are that's suspicious, or we know they're being scammed. And so what I'll do is some of the cases I'll refer it over to the MARC. In Tess knows this, the Commerce Department was limited to, we have 17 police officers. And so when I was assistant commissioner, the police officers who, through the umbrella that I had, they reported up to me. They reported to Mike Marvin, who reported to me, and they were all licensed police officers. And our jurisdiction at that time, ours being Commerce's jurisdiction, was limited basically to insurance fraud, unless, the other agencies reached out, local law enforcement reached out to Commerce for some help with some specific case. Now Commerce, as of the legislative session that ended in 2022, they have jurisdiction over financial fraud cases. And so that's much broader jurisdiction. And they were given, I think, 5 additional full-time employees. And so they can now do these cases. And we're trying to figure out, when I get some more resources, then we're going to try to figure out how to get some of these cases that we can prosecute, and we can work with others, whether it's the federal government or other local jurisdictions, to prosecute some of these people who are money mules and engaged in other activity that we can. I have access to FinCEN. So when I get a name, I run the name through FinCEN whenever I get a victim. I mean, it opens up just unbelievable amounts of information to me. I say, okay, why is this guy who's making pizzas in New Jersey, why did he process $500,000 at a bank account or bank financial institutions? Can't explain. And he's lost 3 accounts. We know what he's doing. He's got my victim's money and a whole bunch of other victims' money, but getting somebody to prosecute that guy who's in New Jersey, it has been a challenge, and it's a challenge for me because I don't have time to write the stuff, finish the investigation and do it. I'm a 1-person operation, but now hopefully with these other resources and with our partnering with our law enforcement people, we can actually make a difference. And it's extremely hard to get any money back for the victims. So now hopefully we can move faster on some of these cases.
Is there a threshold you see that where prosecutors are more interested in doing something as far as like how much money's been lost?
That's a great question. And it's really how much the prosecutor knows. When I dealt with insurance, and when I was insurance investigator, sometimes I'd get people who would admit under oath that they stole $50,000 in premiums from their customers. And I'd call the county attorney and say, I have a recording under oath that the person agreed that they stole $45,000. I did have a case like that. And the local prosecutor said, well, I don't do those cases. It's just not what we do. The insurance company was the victim. People don't like insurance companies. And so we're not going to take that kind of case. That's not what we do. Okay. Well, that's one prosecutor, but if I brought it to, Ramsey County, I guarantee you that they would take that case. And so sometimes it depends on the prosecutor, and law enforcement is overloaded with these fraud cases. And once they lead out of the state or out of the law enforcement jurisdiction, they're pretty hard for them to do anything about.
Thanks, Marty. We have a comment from my friend Jeff. It says, I can attest that Marty from Commerce is a tremendous resource to help with financial fraud. He's a great partner and is truly looking out for the consumers. He recommends financial institutions contact your state representatives to help get more money appropriated for this function of commerce. I'm sure you like to hear that, Marty.
I do, and Jeff's a good guy. Worked with him. Yep, thank you.
More money. All right, so we have a question. If someone lives alone and is not a senior citizen, but they've been repeatedly victimized by more than 2 scams in the past few years, and bankers and tellers have expressed concerns that this person is experiencing cognitive deficiency or decline. Is there anything we can do as a financial institution for this person? There are no joint holders or diagnoses that we know of.
Well, those are the cases that I work on, and I try to build rapport. I have one person who's been calling me for about 3. Dr. DeLima knows. She interviewed him for for a different research project, and I literally deal with the guy every single week. And it's short conversations, just reminding the person why they shouldn't send the money. $300 to get $50,000. They're not going to get it, or the grant or whatever it is. So, there is no I talked to a financial institution the other day. There's no magic wand about this, to get people to stop sending money to scammers. And what you find is these are not one and dones. I always remind people who are victims that it's not over. They're going to come back with different names and try different things, or they're going to sell your name to other people who are going to try new scams on you. So you really need to be aware going forward that, you're going to be on people's lists for a long time.
And if there is signs that the person might be struggling, cognitively or maybe with mental health issues, like, you can do a MARC report for someone like that. That is a vulnerability, even though they're under age 65. But yeah, it does strike me as that this is a person who needs a lot of hand-holding, a lot of coaching, a lot of conversations, and just, a lot of pushback. And then also, there is the last resort of firing the client.
There's a question about whether there's a cost to get into the program 45A, they're saying. So that's just the statute that the Senior Safe Act is under, but a cost for a customer to get into this program.
Yeah, I often charge the customers a small fee. No, I'm just kidding. Oh, there is no cost. And people say, how do I know you're not a scammer? I say, well, the reason you know I'm not a scammer is because I'm not asking you for personal information and I'm not asking you for money. And if I ever do either of those two, you should contact law enforcement immediately. They say, okay.
A question about if filing the MARC, is the Department of Commerce report ever filed by MARC investigators separately? Or should both reports be filed by the filer? So should they do both reports, or do you share?
In the past, we did not share. We tried to get reports from the MARC, and we had many discussions, but since Dr. DeLima's been on board, or since his grant's been in place, I've gotten numerous reports because we've worked it out with Mary McGurran. Mary's great to work with over at the MARC, and she has given guidance, great guidance to Adult Protective Services. So now all of a sudden I'm getting a lot of reports from Adult Protective Services, where in the past we were getting 0 reports. But as to that specific question, if you suspect vulnerability, yes, you should file with the MARC. If you put a hold, the financial institutions can put a hold on the client's funds. And if you do, then you're required to make a report to the MARC. But the MARC doesn't always send Commerce. The vast majority of the time, Commerce does not get, we're not, at law enforcement and Adult Protective Services receive the reports, is my understanding, from the MARC. Commerce does not. So if you want Commerce's help, then you should file directly with Commerce. If you filed a MARC report, they do so many things. Their report is much more comprehensive than if you check out that link that I put in the chat, you'll see Commerce asked, I made sure we just asked them the bare minimum, because I know you have the BSA people and everyone else who make these reports. I know they're extremely busy. So I tried to just get the bare details. Who's the perpetrator, or excuse me, first it's who's the victim, who's the perpetrator, do they have a power of attorney, guardian, conservator, anything like that? Just give us some of the facts, and whatever you think are pertinent. I can follow up with you later to get more information if necessary. And then who are you? That's it.
Mm-hmm. Marty, just really quickly, would it be helpful if folks noted in the report to you that they also filed the MARC report? Because that would indicate to you that you don't need to go ahead and do it a duplicate report.
That would be helpful. Or if they have filed a mark report and they know an investigator's working on it and, you know, the activity's still going on and they want help, then yeah, if you're filing a mark report, you know, let them know that you filed it with me, so they'll contact me. And I'll do the same thing if I know who's working on it with APS, because we do different things, and working together, you know, I think we get better results than, you know, each doing our own thing with certain people in certain types of instances.
Okay, we have time for one more question. I'll just say quickly that you don't need to have any definitive proof to file the report. The statute says that you should have a reasonable belief. So that's all that you need, that there's reasonable beliefs that exploitation is occurring. So for our last question, when should we report something while is it in progress, or should we wait until the financial institution has handled the situation?
You know, I leave that up to the financial institution. You know, a lot of the cases that we get at Commerce, the financial institution is kind of running into a wall with the client, or they just don't have the time to spend with the client. Then, you know, refer it over and we'll try to help you with the process. Oftentimes, you know, financial institutions oftentimes are hesitant to put holds on their clients' funds. And they know they're going to tick off their client, and there's a whole host of issues there. And referring it over to Commerce helps, because they have an outside person that your client's going to know that I don't have a horse in their race. And I tell them that. I say, look, I'm going to give it to you straight. That's it. And, you know, I just ask them to make a little chart with the positives and the negatives. And I tell them, I don't know if you're being scammed. Oftentimes I do, but I tell them, if you tell them that early on, then they don't believe you. So you just have to tell them, here's the positive things that support scams. Here's the negative things that are, you know, either way, however you want to express it, that it's not a scam. And then I ask them at the end, you know, what do you conclude from that? And hopefully that helps them to see it. But there are some people you just can't help. There are people that I failed with. I can't help them.
Right. So if you have a customer that is not listening to you, Marty is a great resource to try, and you don't have to wait till this is all over. He might be able to stop them from doing some of this. We need to wind it up now. So I want to say thank you to Dr. DeLima. We really appreciate you presenting on this, and to Marty again, thank you for joining us, and thank you to everyone who watched this. This will be on our YouTube page, posted on our YouTube page if you want to watch it again later, or have one of your coworkers watch. Thanks for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.